Kaan is wrong. I will never follow him. I will never join the Brotherhood. Kas'im sighed. Then your life ends here. And he leapt in, his weapon moving with far more speed than he'd ever shown during their practice sessions. Parrying the first sequence, Bane realized his former master had always been holding something in reserve, just as Bane himself had done in the early stages of his battle against Sirak. Only now was he seeing Kas'im's true ability, and he was barely able to defend himself. Barely, but still able. His opponent grunted in surprise as Bane warded him off, then stepped back to regroup. He'd come in hard and fast, expecting to end their battle quickly. Now, he had to reevaluate his strategy. "You're better than you were when we last fought," he said, clearly impressed and making no attempt to hide it. "So are you," Bane responded. Kas'im lunged in again, and the room was filled with the hiss and hum of lightsabers striking each other half a dozen times in the space of 2 heartbeats. Bane would have been carved to ribbons had he tried to react to each move individually. Instead, he simply called upon the Force, letting it flow through him and guide his hand. He gave himself over to the dark side completely, without reservation. His weapon became an extension of the Force, and he responded to the Twi'lek's unstoppable attack with an impenetrable defense. Then he went on the attack. In the past, he had always been afraid to surrender his will to the raw emotions that fueled the dark side. Now he had no such limitations. For the first time, he was calling on his full potential. He drove Kas'im back with furious slashes, forcing his old mentor into a backpedaling retreat across the floor of the chamber. Kas'im flipped back and out through the door to the hall beyond. But Bane was relentless in his pursuit, leaping forward and coming within a centimeter of landing a crippling blow to the Twi'lek's leg. His strike was turned aside at the last second, but he quickly followed it up with another series of powerful thrusts and stabs. The Blademaster continued to give ground, pushed inexorably back by the raging storm of Bane's onslaught. Each time he tried to change tactics or switch forms, Bane anticipated, reacted, and seized the advantage. The outcome was inevitable. Bane was simply too strong in the Force. Only some unexpected maneuver could save Kas'im, but they had fought too many times in the past for him to surprise Bane now. Over the course of his training, Bane had seen every possible sequence, series, move, and trick with the double-bladed lightsaber, and he knew how to counter and nullify them all. The Blademaster became desperate. Leaping, spinning, ducking, rolling, he was wild and reckless in his retreat, seeking now only to escape with his life. But he didn't know the temple like Bane did. Bane kept the routes to the outside cut off, slowly herding his opponent into a dead-end hallway. Recognizing what was happening, Kas'im blew open the heavy door of a side room with the Force and dived inside. Bane knew there was no other exit, and he paused at the threshold of the room to savor his victory. The Twi'lek stood in the center of the empty chamber, panting heavily, stooped ever so slightly, his head bowed. He looked up when Bane stepped through the doorway, but when his gaze met Bane's, there was no hint of defeat in his eyes. "You should have finished me when you had the chance," he said. There was less than 5 meters between them, but it was just enough space for Kas'im to give the hilt of his lightsaber a quick twist. The long handle separated in the middle, and suddenly he was armed not with one double-bladed lightsaber, but with a pair of single blades, one in each hand. Bane hesitated. Few of the students at the academy had even attempted to use 2 sabers at once. The Blademaster had always discouraged them from this variation of the fourth form, saying it was inherently flawed. Now, as he saw the cruel and cunning expression on his enemy's face, Bane understood the real truth. The battle was rejoined, but now it was Bane who was in full retreat. Without proper training, even his enormous command of the Force was unable to anticipate the unfamiliar sequences of the two-handed fighting style. His mind was flooded with a million options of what his opponent might attempt, and he had no experience to draw on to eliminate any of them. Overwhelmed, he staggered back, floundering with the desperation of a drowning man. Within the first few passes, Bane knew he couldn't win. Kas'im had trained his entire life for this moment. After years of study, he'd mastered all 7 forms of the lightsaber. Then he'd honed his skills for decades, perfecting every move and sequence until he'd become the perfect weapon and the greatest living swordsman in the galaxy. Maybe the greatest swordsman ever. Bane was no match for him. The Blade Master was unrelenting in his pressure. He seemed to wield 6 blades rather than 2. He attacked with a peculiar rhythm designed to keep his foe off balance, coming in with one blade high and the other low at the same time, striking from opposite sides at odd and opposing angles. Bane had no option but to fall back and back and back. He was fighting now with a single purpose, somehow escaping with his life. One hope gave him the strength to persevere in the face of overwhelming odds. One advantage the Blade Master had lacked during his own retreat. He knew the layout of the temple, and he was able to work himself slowly toward the exit. Battling through the halls and corridors, the combatants rounded a corner to bring them in sight of the Rakatan temple's only entrance. The wide archway and the small landing beyond, with the wide staircase leading back down to the ground nearly 20 meters below. In the instant it took Kas'im to recognize where they were and realize that his opponent might still escape, Bane thrust out with the Force. He knocked the Twi'lek off balance for a brief second, then backflipped out through the archway and onto the landing. He dropped into a crouch, still facing his opponent. But in his haste, Bane had leapt too far. He was balanced precariously on the precipice of the uppermost stair, the steps falling sharply away behind him. Kas'im responded by using the Force to knock Bane backward, sending him tumbling down the great stone staircase away from the Blade Master. The fall would have broken his neck, or at least fractured an arm or a leg, if Bane hadn't cocooned himself in the Force. Even so, he reached the bottom, bruised, battered, and momentarily stunned. On the landing high above, Kas'im stood beneath the massive arch of the temple entrance, staring down at him. "I will follow you wherever you run," he said. "Wherever you go, I will eventually find you and kill you. Don't live your life in fear, Bane. Better to end it now." "I agree," Bane replied, hurling out the wave of Force energy he'd been gathering during the Blade Master's speech. There was nothing subtle about Bane's attack. The massive shock wave shook the very foundations of the great Rakatan temple. The concussive blast had enough power to shatter every bone in Kas'im's body and pulverize his flesh into a mass of pulpy liquid. But at the last possible instant, he threw up a shield to protect himself from the attack. Unfortunately, he couldn't shield the temple around him. The walls exploded into great chunks of rubble. The archway collapsed in a shower of stone, burying Kas'im beneath tons of rock and mortar. A second later, the rest of the roof caved in, drowning out the Twi'lek's dying screams with a deafening rumble. Bane watched the spectacle of the temple's implosion from the safety of the ground at the foot of the stairs. Billowing clouds of dust rolled out from the wreckage and down the stairs toward him. Exhausted by the long lightsaber battle and drained by the sudden unleashing of the Force, he simply lay there until he was covered in a layer of fine white powder. Eventually he struggled wearily to his feet. Reaching out with the Force, he sought some sign that Kas'im might still be alive beneath the mountain of stone. He felt nothing. Kas'im, his mentor, the only instructor at the academy who had ever actually helped him, was dead. Darth Bane, Dark Lord of the Sith, turned his back and walked away.